It's a topic that's been debated for years now, but today we're going to try to get to the bottom of it. So, who would win in a fight? Light or Lelouch? For those who haven't seen Death Note or Code Geass in their entirety, I suggest pausing the video, watching both of those shows, then coming back. That's something you'll do, right? Because in order to reach a conclusion here, we're gonna have to spoil both of these shows. So with that out of the way, let's look at our fighters. First up is Light, the main character from Death Note. He's basically a hyper-intelligent high school student who eventually comes across a great power that he uses to try and influence and better the world. Now, the item that he finds is the little black notebook called the Death Note, and inside of it, it basically explains that anybody whose name is written in it will die. Plus, it has about 66 rules to it, but that's the gist of it for now. Essentially, throughout the course of the show, Light writes down the names of anybody that he thinks is bad or evil or just anybody who's after him inside the Death Note in order to make the world a better place. He kinda wants to be the king of the world. Our next fighter is Lelouch. Basically, he's a hyper-intelligent high school student who one day comes across a great power that he uses to try and influence the world. This is, sound familiar. But the major difference here is the powers. Instead of having a notebook wherein he writes people's names and then they eventually die, however he says in the notebook, he gets an eye. Well, more accurately, he gets what he likes to call a Geass, which is basically just a superpower that causes people to do whatever he wants when he looks them in the eye and tells them to do stuff. It's mind control. It's basically mind control that people forget about after it happens. It's mind control. They do whatever the hell he wants, mind control, done. And like the Death Note, there's also a couple rules to it. Now, to me, it seems the reason that people want these two to fight each other or go against each other in some epic climactic battle is because they're both hyper intelligent and a little bit sociopathic. Both of them want to form the world in the image that they think is best for it by using these powers, which drives them a little bit crazy. And here's where that spoiler thing comes into play, because by the end of each of their series, they both die. Except for maybe Lelouch, but we're not going to talk about that. So let's take a hard look at these guys and see which one would win in a fight. Now, right off the bat, when looking at these two characters, you think they're a little bit too similar, almost the same guy, but really, they're not. Because the two of them each operate incredibly differently, and they're both intelligent in different ways. Now, both of these characters have alter egos, but the major difference here is in how they utilize them. Light's alter ego is called Kira, or Killer. He basically works in the shadows and never goes out into the limelight or has any grandstanding gestures. He's kinda the boogeyman. Whereas Zero, Lelouch's alter ego, is the polar opposite. He is in the limelight because he's basically the face of a revolution. Now, right off the bat, that seems to give Light the edge, because it seems as though Lelouch will have a far more difficult time finding out who Kira is, since he hides in the shadows, than Light will finding out who Zero is, because he's always front and center. But there's also a flip side to this argument, because towards the beginning of Death Note, people start to suspect Light as being Kira. And the way that they go about this is actually pretty simple. They start to pinpoint who's dying and where. Because basically what Light's been doing is he's been watching the news and then killing bad people that he sees on the news with the Death Note. So basically all they have to do is decide where he is based on what news is being aired where at what time. It gets to the point where halfway through the first season, people are already suspecting him specifically of being the killer. And that kind of falls into Lelouch's wheelhouse. Because two things that Lelouch is really good at is finding people and geography. That's pretty much been displayed throughout all of Code Geass. And this is because Lelouch sees everything as a game of chess, so anything geographical he sees as a battlefield, sees as a strategic location, and any person involved in whatever he's dealing with is a pawn or a knight or a bishop. They're all pieces on a chessboard to him. So him being able to find any one of them in any geographic location and pinpoint their exact identity or exact location isn't exactly out of the realm of possibility. But that doesn't mean he's going to have an easy time doing it, because Light, theoretically, should be able to find out who he is first. Only not really, because Zero is constantly wearing a mask, and this is very important for this fight. You see, because Zero's helmet covers Lelouch's entire head, and it seems like it rarely comes off accidentally in the show, so really the only person who would be able to take it off is Lelouch himself. This would make Light finding out his identity very, very difficult since he can't see his face. But then there's the argument that he could just go to wherever Zero is and track him back to his house, but that also doesn't seem very likely. Because you see, throughout most of Death Note, Light works in a very constricted area. He basically works around where he lives and kills people around that area. Where Lelouch pretty much goes all over Tokyo. He goes wherever he's needed to fight his enemy. And it really seems like the only people being able to track Lelouch are the ones doing it suspecting that he is Zero, not the other way around. Nobody ever really tracks him as Zero back to being Lelouch. Instead, they track Lelouch until they see him become Zero, and that doesn't really happen. The only case I can think of where somebody actually discovers his secret via that method is a girl named Shirley, who's tracking him going, is that Zero? That might be Zero, after somebody told her, hey, that's Zero. And she ends up losing him. The only reason she even discovers that he's Zero in the first place is she ends up finding him on a fluke with his mask off and the rest of his attire on. That's it. So based on the intelligence of the people going after Lelouch, most of which are nearly as intelligent as him, it does seem pretty unlikely that Light would be able to find out who he is without some help. But let's not undercut his intelligence, because Light is very, very intelligent, easily comparable to Lelouch himself. So what if he did find him? Let's assume that he does follow Zero and he does find out who Lelouch is and where he lives. At this point, really all he has to do is go around school and ask everybody, hey, what's that kid's name? At which point, the second he finds out, he heads over to his handy dandy death note and jots down the name Lelouch Lamperouge. Except, that's not Lelouch's name. Lelouch's real name is Lelouch v. Britannia, but he goes by Lelouch Lamperouge because he had to kind of fake his own death. And here's where I want to talk about the first clause of the Death Note that matters in this battle. There's a rule in the Death Note that says if a person's name is misspelled 4 times, then the Death Note will not work on them, and you have to assume that Light will mess up at least this one time, because he doesn't know his real name. Also, I'm not undercutting his intelligence here, but look at that name. Just look at that name. I find it almost impossible to believe that he's not going to try a different spelling of it at least once. But maybe that's just me. Either way, that's a very important clause, because at this point, Light not only has to find out who Zero actually is, he has to find out who Lelouch actually is. And that's going to be kind of difficult, because he's actually a Britannian, and if you look at his family, he doesn't look like any of them, except maybe his mom. You see, what happened is, after Lelouch's mother had been killed, he went after his father thinking that he had a part in the assassination, so his father sent him to Japan and then bombed the shit out of it. So basically everybody thinks that Lelouch is actually dead, but he's not. And I find it a little bit difficult to believe that Light's going to be able to put that information together in any relevant time. It's going to be pretty difficult for him to figure out that this guy is actually the presumed deceased son of the Britannian Emperor. So right now it kind of looks like things are in Lelouch's corner, like he's going to have a bit of an easier time finding out who Light is than the other way around. But Light kind of has a trump card. The Shinigami Eyes. For those who don't know what a Shinigami is or what Shinigami Eyes are, a Shinigami is basically a god of death, and all Death Notes belong to gods of death unless they're dropped on Earth. It's kind of a huge thing, but essentially Shinigamis or gods of death have Death Notes, and Light just happened to get one. Now what's important about a Shinigami's eyes is that they can see how long a person has to live and what their real name is, so they can write it down in the Death Note for when they're gonna die. Now a human in possession of a Death Note can make a deal to get the Shinigami eyes at the cost of half of their lifespan. So theoretically, if Light got the Shinigami eyes and made that deal, he could just look right at Lelouch, tell how long he has left to live, and his real name, which would pretty much keep him in this fight. But here's the thing, Light never gets the Shinigami eyes. He elects not to. He's offered the deal, but chooses not to because the price is too high, and ultimately, it results in his death. But this is a theoretical fight, so let's assume that the two did meet up, and Light saw Lelouch is a big enough threat to make that deal. So at this point, all Light has to do is get the Shinigami eyes, sit at home, look at Zero on the news, and write his name down, right? Well, no, because as is the way of Death Note, there are rules to the Shinigami eyes as well. You have to be able to see at least 50% of a person's face for it to work. So he would still have to figure out who Zero actually is in order for the eyes to even work. And I know what some of you are thinking, no, he doesn't have to figure out who he actually is, he just has to get the helmet off. But no, that's not true either, because Lelouch is incredibly paranoid, and underneath his helmet is a mask that covers up to his nose. And if you look at the Shinigami rules, it says that you have to be able to see from the top of someone's head to their nose, which the mask covers up. So even if you believe that he can somehow get the helmet off that only Lelouch knows how to get off, he'd still have to get close enough to get off the mask, and that puts him in Geass range. Now we've talked a lot about Death Note rules, let's talk a little bit about Code Geass rules. In order for the Geass to work, Lelouch has to be able to look you in the eye within 272 meters, and then he can tell you what to do. And he doesn't just have to tell you one thing. As long as he has that eye contact, he can tell you as many things as he wants, essentially, in whatever time period he wants, and you're gonna do them. He takes complete control, but he can only do this once, meaning the second he breaks eye contact, he can't do it again to the same person. And this creates a very innate flaw with the Geass, because if Lelouch misuses it and does not kill Light with it, then he's done. He can never use it again. Whereas Light has infinite pages in the Death Note, so it kinda seems to be in his favor. And the other important thing about the Geass is you cannot make somebody do something that they are incapable of doing. Basically, you can't make them fly across the sky for no reason. This is gonna come up in a minute. Now, theoretically, for Lelouch to win, all he has to do is pinpoint where Kira is, which is the school that they pinpoint with the Kira Kill Force or whatever the hell it was called, and L. What they pinpoint is his school in his area. So all Lelouch has to do is go between each person in the school completely anonymously and be like, hey, are you Kira? No? Okay, are you Kira? No, and just go across the line till he finds Light. But Light has a way around that. Very early on in the series, Light is suspected of being Kira by the Kira Kill Force or whatever the fuck the cops are called, and L. So what they do is they confine him and they question him. And the interesting thing about this is there's another clause in the Death Note, except this one works out in his favor. You see, what the clause says is that if he loses possession of the Death Note, basically if he gives it up, he loses all memory of having the Death Note. So all they're questioning, he's answering honestly. He honestly believes that he is not Kira. He has no idea who it is because he no longer possesses the Death Note, so he no longer has the memories. Which means that if Lelouch questions him, he can answer honestly, I'm not Kira, if he uses this. If he knows that Lelouch is after him, he can do this to get around that. Only, maybe he can't. This one admittedly is a little bit shadier. In a non-canon Code Geass story, it's revealed that Lelouch's Geass can actually bring back repressed memories. Now, this normally wouldn't be valid because it's non-canon, but throughout Code Geass, he never deals with repressed memories. He never tries to bring that back. So we might see in Season 3 that he very well is capable of doing that. So based on only the knowledge that we have, it is possible. It's not necessarily probable and it's definitely not for sure, but it is possible that even if Light uses that method to lose his own memories and be able to answer honestly that he's not Kira, that Lelouch might still be able to get around that. Okay, so at this point it kind of seems like things might be in Lelouch's favor again, except they might not be. Because here's something that nobody ever seems to know about the Death Note itself. When a human uses the Death Note, they become possessed by a god of death, the god of death who originally possessed the Death Note. So while we know the Geass works on humans, would it work on a god of death? Because even though the god of death doesn't come out, it doesn't control Lelouch like the exorcism of Emily Rose, it doesn't do anything like that, it's still in there, it's still somewhere in his subconscious. So would the Geass be able to work against a god of death? Well, yeah. You see, late in the series, Lelouch actually uses his Geass on a god during the battle against his father. And it works. Now this has been hotly debated by fans, whether or not it worked, whether or not he used the Geass, but according to the Code Geass wiki, which is kind of the only relevant source that I have, it seems legit. So there's really no reason to think that it wouldn't work in Light's world if it works in Lelouch's. So right about now, things are looking pretty bad for old Light. And this is where I want to go back to the downfall of the Geass itself. You see, if he uses it incorrectly on Light, he can never use it on him again. That's a huge problem. Think of it this way, what if he asks him the wrong question? What if he tells him to do the wrong thing? What if he trusts him? There are 1,000 different ways that the Geass could be used improperly against Light, and then he'd never be able to use it again. But this is also kinda the final nail in the coffin for Light. You see, Light only has one way to win. He needs to find out who Lelouch is, and that's going to be incredibly difficult for him. He has to find out his real name. He has to be able to envision his face in order to write it down in the Death Note, or else he could kill another person by the name of Lelouch B. Britannia. And then of course he has to actually write down the name. All of this has to be done in order for him to win. Lelouch just has to kill Light. He doesn't have to do it with his Geass. He doesn't have to make him kill himself with his Geass. He could fuck up his Geass on Light and then figure out who he is and send a militia after him. He could send all of Tokyo to kill Light because he can control all of them. Light doesn't control anybody. He can't control anybody. He can only kill with the Death Note when he knows a person's name and a person's face, and it's going to be much harder for him to find out those things about Lelouch than the inverse. Because honestly, as it seems, Lelouch is kind of tailor-made to go against him. He wears a helmet, he has a mask over his face, his name is hidden. Everything about Lelouch seems to counter everything about Light. His Geass, while having only one use on Light, can be used on anybody else, and he can use any of those other people to kill Light. And honestly, at the beginning of their series, Light is a little bit dumber than Lelouch. He's not as well hidden, even though he's working from the shadows and Zero is in the limelight all the time. It's a lot easier to find Light. They do it almost immediately. Whereas it takes a hell of a lot longer for them to find Lelouch. And at this point, I assume I'm going to get a lot of people talking about, oh, what about Miso? What about Ryuk? What about Rem? What about the other guy who works for Light at the end? What about all these people that help him out? Well, if you include those people, you have to also include the people who help Lelouch. And he basically has an army. And I understand that a death god or a god of death, a Shinigami, is super powerful. But the thing is, Ryuk doesn't want to help Light. He only helps him when it serves his purposes, when it helps entertain Ryuk. Ryuk has no vested interest in Light. The only reason that Rem helped out Light is because Misa's life was in order. He had leverage over Rem, so she helped him out. He doesn't have any leverage over Ryuk. Ryuk is basically those Michael Jackson popcorn memes. He's just there to be entertained. He doesn't actually care about who wins. He doesn't care about Light. As a matter of fact, the Death Note itself prohibits Ryuk from helping him. He cannot help him kill anybody, he cannot tell him their real names, and he cannot stop him from dying, or else Ryuk will die, and Ryuk clearly cares way more about himself than he ever will about anything, including doing his own job. Whereas if we included all of Lelouch's people, he has a literal army, along with mechs and Spin Kick Boy, and a girl that can give the Geass to anybody she chooses. Oh look, now he's going against an army of Geass people. Light is fucked. And that's not to say that Light couldn't win given the perfect circumstances if he found out who Lelouch was, and if he remained hidden in the shadows and all these other things, but given an even playing field, they're also pretty even mentally. Generally speaking, Lelouch just has more tools, and the tools that he has counter Light's. That's all there is to it. And here to me is the biggest reason why Lelouch wins, because beyond all of the powers and all of the stipulations, at the end of their series, what happens? They both die. But why do they die? Light dies because he's too arrogant to accept power at a cost. He thinks he can beat anybody without the power of the Shinigami Eyes, and ultimately he dies because of it. Lelouch, on the other hand, defeats the Britannian Empire and unites the world against him. He makes himself the villain and dies in order to unite the world. At the end of the day, Light and Lelouch each have the same goal. But Light fails. Lelouch succeeds. This has been an incredibly difficult video to make, guys. Getting all the information together and trying to assess out who would win in what situation and all that stuff has been really, really hard. I actually had a lot more stuff that I decided not to put into this video because it would just make it way too long. But I figured with each of these characters being relevant now, Death Note getting the remake on Netflix and Code Geass getting a season 3, that it'd probably be time to kind of put my thoughts together and see who would win given whatever situation. If you guys disagree, if you think Light could win, if you think that there's a way, please let me know in the comments down below. I have looked over and over and over through both of these series, both of the mangas, pretty much every single piece of material I could get my hands on, and I just didn't see it. But if you guys do see it, if there's some loophole or stipulation that I missed, please let me know in the comments down below. And if you want to see some other kind of versus thing where two guys are really similar, I might do another one. I don't know. That's it for me, guys. These lights are hot. I've said everything I gotta say. If you disagree, comment down below. I'm done. Later.
He's a loser, he's a loser. I got a new car, driving slow from the start. It looks cool though, it looks cool though. It's not what I need, it's not what I feel.